Good afternoon. I'm Anuj Mehrotra, Dean of the George Washington University School of Business, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this episode of George Talks Business. As you know, we have dedicated February sessions of George Talks Business to artificial intelligence, and our goal is to raise awareness about AI in a series of sessions covering multiple angles and disciplines in collaboration with the Schools of Engineering, Public Health, and Law at GW. I am delighted to introduce our distinguished guest in just a moment, but first, let me introduce my co-host for today's session, John Lack, Dean of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. Thank you for joining us today, John.
Thanks so much for having me, Anuj, and for helping to grow the partnership between our two schools.
Thank you. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest today, Dr. Nicol Turner-Lee, a senior fellow in governance studies, director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution, and co-editor-in-chief of Tech Tank. Thank you for joining us today, Nicol.
Oh, thanks for having me, Dean. I really appreciate it, or both Deans. I appreciate you having me today.
So, Nicol, we will talk about AI and policy in a little bit, but let me first ask you to talk a little bit about your background and your role at the Brookings Institution.
Oh, happy to do so. Well, first and foremost, again, thanks for having me on the show. I am a sociologist, so if anybody is confused about my background, let me just be real clear that I actually am a scientist in the social sciences. And what does that have to do with engineering and technology? Well, at the Brookings Institution, I'm a senior fellow in governance studies, and I also am the director of the Center for Technology Innovation at Brookings. And at the center, we focus on regulatory and legislative policy issues that fall in the areas of tech and telecommunications. And what's so exciting about this, I've been doing this about 25 years. I know I don't look that old, but just in case, part of what I've actually found is that there's this intersection between the technology itself and how quickly it outpaces policymaking, particular demographic groups, which is the focus of my research when it comes to racial demographics, ethnicities, or other vulnerable characteristics, and the rate of innovation. And that has a lot to do with whether or not policymakers can keep up with the speed of innovation to ensure consumer protection. So, Dean, a lot of what I do in my work is to really embolden the scholars that work in CTI to write about these issues, to write about them in real time. I'm honestly here to tell you the issues are not, there's not an exhausted list of issues. We are actually working on these issues day in and day out. I get up every day about 5:30 in the morning just to see what has happened in the world. One of the things that we try to do, again, is to advance evidence-based policymaking and research so that other legislators, as well as civil society organizations and industry and academia, can really take from these conversations real good pieces to place into quality legislation.
Thank you, Nicol. And we are really eager to get into some of those details that you're talking about, which will be directly, we would love to hear from you. But, let me start, however, from our last AI session last week. Our guest, Professor Stuart Russell, he talked about the global state of artificial intelligence and the problem of control. And we would like to ask you the same question that we asked Professor Russell, but from your vantage point, as a sociologist and a policy researcher, how would you describe the current role of AI in our society? Is it really serving the public good, or should we be scared of its rapid advances?
That's interesting. So a portion of my work is in digital inclusion or digital divide work, of which I have a book coming out. But another portion of it spends a lot of time looking at artificial intelligence systems and the impact on society, again, by sociological stance. Listen, know that technology is rapidly changing and transforming how we live, learn, and earn, and in some cases, how we love. And there are always two sides of the coin. There's a side of the coin where technology works for the public interest, the public good, the use of drone surveillance, for example, and autonomous systems to help in climate change, to help us to figure out the latest advances in precision medicine or precision agriculture. Then there is the aspect of technology that can have a sociological implication. Based on the context in which it is deployed, it can be out of hand. And we have operated in the space of innovation along the lines of what I call permissionless innovation. And in the last few years, because the pace of technology outpaces policymaking, we now have seen what I consider to be permissionless forgiveness, where there have been unintended consequences to certain populations because of the use of AI that has weaponized it against them, whether it's in the eligibility determinations of financial services, housing, credit worthiness, or even in some cases, a person's ability to be part of an educational program or, have the type of eligibility for a medical program. And I can give cases of where we've actually seen this pan out. The key thing is it all depends on who sits at the table in the design and development of that technology and the extent to which it's deployed in ways that are responsible, inclusive, as well as ethical. Because anything can happen with technology. We've seen that over the course of the last few decades with the emergence of technology. But in the case of AI, it becomes particularly concerning if the AI is weaponized against certain populations, because it is harnessing the human intelligence that we have, as people, have never had encased within our own ability, at least expeditiously.
Thanks, Nicole. I completely agree. I mean, one of the big concerns about recent advances in AI is the evidence that some of these predictive models and algorithms have demonstrated a racial and gender bias. And for example, some recent studies, including one by GW's own computer science professor, Eileen Kelliskin, showed bias in Uber and Lyft pricing in neighborhoods where residents are predominantly people of color. So as a sociologist and policy researcher, as you said, when you see these kinds of studies, do you have some thoughts about how we can take steps to try to address them?
Yeah, I mean, I want to say Eileen's work is fantastic. I mean, we're actually working with her, showcasing that at Brookings. So glad to have that informal partnership with GW. I mean, at the end of the day, what we have to do is do a couple of things. First and foremost, when we're thinking about what to automate, we have to think about who is at the table in the decision to actually move forward. If you have a table which is predominantly homogenous and excluding people who are going to be impacted by the model, that should really be a sign. I was interviewed earlier today about diversity in AI companies and the extent to which the lack of diversity lends itself to these predatory outcomes. Of course it does. You're sitting at a table where the majority of people are white males. Guess what? The context and the values and assumptions and norms about the design of the project are actually going to be, predicated on what they think about the world. With that being the case, to your point, Dean, we know that when not checked or not interdisciplinary in terms of its creation, that we can see predictive models that over incarcerate Black men. So criminal justice algorithms that are designed to help judges make more precise and accurate determinations on whether or not someone should be detained or free are actually based on data that's already flawed. We live in a system where the criminal justice system starts out disproportionately incarcerating or arresting people of color. This, as a sociologist, I knew this, the stuff that I read. And here we now have models that are dependent upon this flawed training data to make what they believe are going to be better judgments. Well, that's not the case. Computers don't bias, people do. And societies in which they're actually contextualized have the ability to influence those outcomes. So I think it's very important that we continuously look at these models, we look at engineering, we look at science, not from a discrete way, but we think about the framing of racial equity and what implications are we either including or we missing when it comes to ensuring that these models have the performance that is equitable when used in any type of context.
Yeah, I mean, you raised a good point. I want to follow up on John's question on that, and I think we want to stay a little bit more on this topic to talk about digital equity and the impact of also artificial intelligence on healthcare. I wanted to hear your thoughts on what you are seeing have been some advantages and examples of how AI is really positively changing the healthcare. And are we also seeing any examples how inequities are playing out in this arena of healthcare as well?
Oh yeah, I mean it's so interesting. So I'm a huge, again, I'm one of those people that's an optimist pessimist, right? It's almost like that introvert extrovert that doesn't exist. I try to tell people I actually am both. They don't quite believe that. On the weekends, I'm not necessarily in front of Zoom. I'm really, curled up and looking at a good book, reading a good book. But with that being the case, there are cases where we know that in healthcare algorithms and AI systems can be very helpful. I mean, the fact that we can actually get a model to extrapolate whether or not someone may have a heart attack or someone may be in the midst of some type of pulmonary arrest, that's particularly important. And it's actually been important in the vaccination development. Some people do not realize the use of AI systems to help us in determining how to best put together models or, formulas that would actually create the vaccination that we have. It's easier with technology. When I was growing up, to share this quick example for your audience, I used to watch 3 cartoons. The Flintstones, where Fred Flintstone drove a car with rocks. The Jetsons, where George Jetson drove around in drones. And Fat Albert, just because that's what every Black kid did in America at that time. With that being the case, the Flintstones are outdated. You don't see any reruns of the Flintstones, but everything in the Jetsons has come true. And so there are very much benefits that are associated with AI when it comes to healthcare, because the speed at which we're able to actually innovate allows us to save lives. With that being the case, we see the other side of it, where AI systems have the potential to discriminate. What does that look like? There was a AI formula developed to determine the eligibility of clients for a program for people with chronic disease. What we actually found in that program is that they used the variable of how much people invested in healthcare. When they applied that to Black patients, they found that historically they do not invest a lot in healthcare, and as a result, many Black patients were kicked out of the program. So high chronic disease instances, eligibility determination based on how much you pay into hospitalization. Where's the story here? They let it up on the front page because the algorithm was actually excluding Black patients. We now see that, and this is beyond the scope of this conversation, outside of a science perspective, how information gets transferred and shared with people. What we're dealing with now in terms of anti-vaccination misinformation that's actually happening to scare Black patients and brown patients away from actually getting vaccinated. Then these are challenges that I think, again, as we as ethical and responsible developers or people who are interested in the evolution of AI, we need to concern ourselves with who is making the decision around these automated processes, who is checking and auditing the extent to which these processes are doing what they say, and then what role is the patient, the client playing in ensuring that they're not being profiled. We live in a society where information surveillance is prevalent. And the extent to which those systems can be weaponized against particular communities, we have to be very careful of, particularly in healthcare, where we know we already have a disparate, fragmented, broken system by which people are provisioned care.
Nicole, I mean, you have really just gotten into an area which is obviously of growing interest, where facial recognition is associated with the misuse of AI. And of course, there are lots of implications for social inequity or equity, as you are talking about, and that is a lot of work that you do in that. We are aware. I actually wanted to talk a little bit more about the causes of these algorithmic biases. What are some of the root causes of these online biases that we are experiencing?
Some of it actually starts with the data that we're actually, well, let me go back because we wrote a paper about this at Brookings. It's available on the Brookings webpage. But, some of it starts with, again, the assumption of the question. So having this question that may be framed in a way that may not necessarily, be vetted to understand the extent to which there'll be unintended consequences starts there. Who's at the table? Who's discussing this? What's the historical precedent? What's the impact if it's contextualized or laid out in these three scenarios? A lot of my research looks at that with companies and developers to make sure they understand the sociological implications of their modeling. Then I think the second part of it rests upon the training data, the extent to which we're using training data that automatically starts out flawed. So if I go back to the criminal justice algorithm, there we already know that we are overrepresenting Black and brown people in mugshot data for facial recognition. If that is the case, and there have been plenty of studies around this, the data that we're going to use will be skewed towards Black faces, which then lends itself to greater levels of misidentification. So I'll give you a perfect example. We know in facial recognition technology, they do not recognize people of browner skin tones. They don't recognize me. And they definitely don't recognize Black women who change their hair. My hair was in braids last week. Today it's straight. Next week it might be curly. With that being the case, that fallibility actually lends itself to the misidentification of criminals. About months ago, a gentleman in Detroit, I believe it was, or 3 months ago, was detained by the Detroit Police Department, and he was misidentified as a criminal. A couple of years ago, members of the Congressional Black Caucus were actually placed into a proprietary facial recognition software program, and they came back as mugshots of identified criminals. So we have a lot to do there with that data, and we must do a better job. And that's why I think universities like yours are actually working to integrate and to highlight the importance of collecting good data. But I wouldn't stop there in terms of where we actually see breakdown. Just because an algorithm says that there's a likelihood that this person may reoffend doesn't always mean that you need to take it at face value. So the lack of human involvement to sort of say, well, we may be 1% right in terms of the variance, being decreased, Well, guess what? You're 1% right, and you're still 1% over the amount of people who really shouldn't be incarcerated in the first place based on a system of racism and discrimination. So I often tell my engineering friends, we need to sort of come to the table. I know it's COVID, we can't do it in person, but we can do it virtually, and just sort of sometimes hash out what I call those blind spots or those areas that give you cause of concern, because you want your prediction to be accurate, but you also want it to be fair. And I think that's where the science and the social sciences always have this, tit for tat and back and forth, because I think how we define fairness can also be elusive to both communities.
Nicole, you're hitting on a really critical issue there. I mean, we know about these biases that exist in these models, these AI models, and then how we use the output of those models, how it informs decision making, and the kind of biases that creep in there. As you said, humans being involved in the decision-making process. And of course, a lot of humans themselves have biases. And so that combination of biases from the model and then biases in natural human decision-making, how do those converge and end up impacting social equity and inclusion?
Oh, well, they can impact it greatly. I mean, it's already hard for certain populations to actually get access to credit or get access to mortgages or whatever the case may be, that maybe in those sensitive use cases, housing, healthcare, education, where that could be, a life or death situation. I'll give you a great recent example. The International Baccalaureate program decided to use an algorithm to assess whether or not students should have a diploma. What landed up happening is this algorithm, despite being, pretty equally weighted in terms of the qualifications, did not take into consideration, because the variable was based on prior performance, that there were some schools that still have the IB program that are public, that are in, under-resourced areas. So you have tons of students who didn't get the diploma simply because the model didn't feel like their school over the course of 4 or 5 years had enough graduates. Well, I mean, go figure. If you're in an inner city school and you're graduating 2 to 3 people from the IB program, that's a great success, but not according to the model. That has implications, because that young person, and I read this and I was also interviewed about this story, they didn't get their diploma, they didn't get their scholarship, they didn't get their enrollment into this particular college or university, which has impacts. There's impacts on the trajectory of poverty. It has impacts on trying to create pathways to social mobility. There's impacts for a new homeowner that may not realize that they're not seeing certain ads because of the way that the AI is skewed away from them based on prior, digital surfing. The bottom line is we have to get this right. Look, I don't care about innocuous micro-targeting and advertisement that actually brings, Black dresses to my feed. I'm okay with that. I like Black dresses. I mean, honestly, I wear mostly blue, but today I'm wearing black. But at the end of the day, those things do not affect my credit. What I'm not okay with, and I think this is the important thing for people to realize about AI, it's not just my purchasing of Black dresses. It's what the internet also knows about my family, that I may have a daughter who likes Black Barbies, that I may actually, buy too many dresses, which may suggest that I'm not credit worthy. When you add that composite profile together, as LaTanya Sweeney at Harvard's work suggests, once I click on that predatory advertisement, that's all I'm going to be served. The algorithmic influence is so strong that it doesn't break that bubble to allow me the opportunity to have presented to me different life chances or opportunities. And so as a result of that, these matter, Deans. They matter because they will have, and this is why I'm in this space, they will have, I think, precipitate potentially the fact that we cannot get certain groups beyond systemic inequalities. Now, not because of, fire hoses and dogs because you wanted to go to school or vote, but now because of a computer model. And that's the sensitivity that I think engineering students need to have. Be ethical, be responsible, be thoughtful, and be inclusive.
Yeah, great. I was just going to ask you exactly about that, as the critical role of education in this, and what are the things that Anuj and I and our colleagues should be teaching our engineering and business students as we work to address these issues. And you hit on a couple of them. If you have any other concrete suggestions, we'd love to hear them.
Well, I think it's only fair that when I was in college, I had to figure out how to move the pig or the cow at least 2 steps by a computer science class that was mandatory. I think it's fair that students today take a social science class. I mean, taking a sociology class and understanding the settled language around sociological differences, I think is just a winner for everybody. because it will blend the thinking and the methodologies to make it much more palatable to have these types of conversations. I also think that there should be the integration of ethics, that engineering students should go through an exercise that recognizes that science is not always discrete, it's not always objective. And so we as scientists, even myself as a sociologist, we all same process. Do I ask this question? Do I ask that question? Which one has the implications for pathological interpretation? Which one actually could change the swerve of the narrative? And so I think it's important that we also have those conversations in ethics class. None of this is easy. I mean, the fact that all three of us are, I'm not going to put it out there on myself only, but we're kind of middle-aged and we've been in our careers and we're just sort of looking at this stuff. And we didn't have a major on this when we were actually in school. That suggests just how fast technology is actually moving. And so as a tech enthusiast, I'm excited about it. I just think now we actually have to have layered conversations because the products do matter.
So I couldn't agree with you more, Nicole, and I think this is great to hear from you. And of course, in the business school, we do definitely have the ethics course for all students to go through. But there's more urgency. We need to do more, and I think these are the kind of conversations and comments that inform our curriculum as well. So I appreciate you mentioning that. Let me change subject just a little bit and really talk a little bit about your forthcoming book, The Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating a New Underclass. So first of all, congratulations on the book, but would love to hear a little bit about your new book. And if you could maybe talk about how this is contributing, how AI is contributing to creating this new underclass. And if you can share some statistics around this, what percentage of population are we talking about when you're talking about that? So any details on that would be greatly welcome.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you. I mean, I feel like this book, I've talked about it for over a year, and if it's not out in the next 2 to 3 weeks to the publisher, I'm going to probably, have somebody else write it, and then I'm going to curl up in a corner, I got my start in technology really focusing on the digital divide. When I was in graduate school, I actually volunteered at a local computer technology center. I built technology centers. I'm a huge fan of bringing low-income people the power of technology because I think it's so transformative. And I think for many of us, we thought, AOL, you got mail, and modem sounds were transformative. I mean, look at what we have now. I mean, what my kids are doing in the other room just amazes me about what we're able to do during a pandemic. With that being the case, 18 million people were not online prior to the pandemic. When 50 million school-age kids were sent home because of the virus, 15 to 16 million of them didn't have home broadband access or an internet-enabled device. 9 million of them didn't have either, and the majority of them were Black and brown kids and kids from rural and tribal lands. So what does that tell you? We have a digital divide in this country. We have one that actually spans back decades. We all knew about it, but the extent to which we paid attention to it was a whole nother story. And in the midst of this digital divide, which is really what the book's narrative is about, we have the growth of the tech sector. We have AI. We have all of these areas which in many respects have lent itself to this pernicious outcome where you have young kids who have to sit on the stoops of Taco Bell to actually get internet access to do schoolwork before and now during the pandemic. You have small farmers that cannot compete with large farmers who are now looking at the last mile connectivity from the edge of their farms, and they'll never be able to use AI and drone surveillance for their crops because they don't even have basic internet. And we're looking at people who run out of data in the middle of the month, and they need their device to be able to tap into day laborer jobs. To me, as Michael Harrington, the sociologist, talked about the other America, this is the new underclass. It's an underclass that we actually have no record of who they are, except what the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, tells us. And they're everyday people that look like many of us on this phone. And how do I know that? I went out and visited them. So I took a year and did a trip of about 7 cities across the United States to gather that data. So this book is really about, the statement about digital access in America. It's been really interesting to write it during a pandemic because it was supposed to be done in February, and I took the liberty to sort of take some of the data from the pandemic and include it in the book. But it will be a very, much scream of testament around how the United States has not looked at digital access as a driver. I'll say this, one of the last chapters that I have in the book is about a tech new deal. I didn't grow up when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was around, but I'm a huge history enthusiast, and I really appreciated the opportunity to rebuild America, the dams, the bridges, the tunnels, and to put people back to work. I think Biden is in the same place. And President Biden has an opportunity through Build Back Better to create a tech new deal, one that doesn't place technology as a complement, but one that puts it in the center of all that we do for economic recovery. That's what the book is about. It's really about how do you, and Ralph Ellison, a famous author who wrote the book, The Invisible Man, sort of narrates this through his protagonist, where he says, at the end of the day, he was never seen, even though he was standing right before many of those folks in which he encountered. So that's really the purpose of the book. We're all consumers, but the extent to which the technology is being leveraged to give us the type of economic opportunities that we not only see here in the United States, but I've been all across the world, that I've actually seen in other places. How do we actually use that technology to break some of these strongholds is really the purpose of the book. And AI plays a role because, unfortunately, just like your researchers have found, if you're not online, you're not part of the algorithm. And if you're not part of the algorithm, you're part of the algorithm that says you're not part of the algorithm, if that makes sense, which is why you don't get certain products and services on the other side of the river or the other side of the railroad track. So hopefully you all will buy it. It's really tough to write it during the pandemic. It's tough when your kids are home and you're trying to write your book at 5:30 in the morning and you want to beat them up before they get up and go to school. But at the end of the day, it's so necessary because we've got to talk about the digital divide differently.
Well, that sounds fantastic. I'll definitely be a reader as soon as it comes out. I'm looking forward to that. You mentioned the Biden-Harris administration and the work that they aim to do around this digital divide. Could you talk a bit more about that with some examples that you expect to see here over the next few years?
Yeah, the Biden administration is going to take the same track, which is why I'm pushing my Tech New Deal to actually invest in rural broadband infrastructure, which for years has been a problem. They will probably also look at ways, in particularly the space of AI, to develop much more like collaborative, multi-stakeholder processes to talk about what it is that we're talking about. We talk about AI bias and AI deployment. The previous administration actually did a lot of that, and so I'm hoping that we'll actually continue that as well. I think we're also going to see in the Biden administration some guardrails when it comes to law enforcement use of AI. We're actually doing a project right now, Brookings, on facial recognition technologies in law enforcement and what that conversation should look like. But I think overall, I hate to say it, but I think what we're going to see in the area of technology, because this administration has so many pandemic responses to put together between the vaccination strategy, getting young people back to school, trying to figure out how to put people back to work. Those are going to be priorities. My fear is that technology, which has basically helped us survive, we now get our groceries online, we love online, we see our family members online, we educate online. My fear is that won't become important. And we're seeing a little bit of that now with school reopening, where we're focusing on the public health consequences and not necessarily making sure that every child is left off, that no child is left offline. With that being the case, he's going to do something, because something had to happen. And I think we're going to see it from a racial equity framework, even when we're talking about, more complicated issues like antitrust. But with that being the case, he's got 100 days, but 100 years to sort of unravel everything that's been done. And I'm really looking at his list of priorities and saying to myself, it's him, not me, when we go forward. And we're just here at Brookings to continue to put out research that supports whatever the administration leaders want to do.
Great, exciting. How about at the state level? Are there certain state policies that are moving forward that you think might end up setting a national precedent? So any examples of regulatory issues at the state level that you've been following?
Oh, of course. One thing for sure, particularly in the area of artificial intelligence, is privacy legislation. If some of you all remember, the EU came forth with the General Data Protection Rules, which now are the GDPR, that guides how information is collected on their citizens. And we're actually impacted by it. If you ever go into a website and says there are cookies, do you accept the use of cookies? That actually comes from a standard behavior change that I think started with the UK. California actually passed their own Privacy Act that for many of us in policy, we thought that the US Congress would actually beat California to the punch, and they haven't. So now we have actually California, which has become, I think, the next country actually implementing their own policies, privacy policies that go way beyond what some of us actually imagined. And we've now also seen, to your point, Dean, bans on facial recognition, privacy laws that are now state guided. What's interesting about that, I'd just like to point out, is that part of this is because many states during the last 4 years have felt that the federal government has done very little. So they just sort of move by their own command. which is fine. I do think in this Congress and under this White House that we're actually going to see more states get on board with a larger plan. Because one of the things we don't want to do, for example, in privacy legislation or any type of AI bans or AI research and development funds, is have a patchwork of issues. When we compare ourselves to China, in particular, who's in a race to AI, we're going to lose because we have too much bureaucracy standing in the way. And unlike China, a country which many of us would say, well, they do things differently in terms of their state control. The bottom line is they have some type of cohesion of what their strategy looks like. And it's the same thing that we should be doing. We really should be thinking about how does the federal, state, and at some points the local levels work together, not just in the passage of laws, but also in procurement and in other spaces, academic, R&D, where AI needs the type of all hands on deck strategy. So, I think going forward, we're going to see a lot more debates as we see more state laws actually come forth as to whether or not there should be preemption of those state laws or what aspects of those state laws we should adopt into federal legislation. But there appears to be some political goodwill and some political will to actually do this, the extent to which with the list of other things that have to get done, will it actually happen this year?
Interesting. At the organization and corporation level, thinking about the kinds of things that motivate them, do you see opportunities for these organizations to generate revenue by offering critical services like internet or healthcare in an equitable manner, and thereby avoiding some reputational and non-compliance headwinds? And or do you expect that organizations will seek to sort of preserve the status quo until technology regulation is increased?
That is such a great question that, it's very hard for any of us to answer, given the fact that there have just been so many events that have happened in the last, month. I mean, between the January 6th insurrection, that in many respects was emboldened not just by the president, but also social media platforms, it speaks volumes to the role of technology in our society and just where we actually see technology going above the line when it comes to civil unrest. And we're seeing that across the globe with regards to that. I think going forward, it will be interesting because I think that there is high reputational risk, particularly after George Floyd was murdered in May by a police officer who had his knee lodged in his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The outpouring of support for his racial equity and social justice was just immeasurable. And we're also looking at an administration that cares about this too. So there are going to be people who care about what they look like in now the private platforms that have become the new public squares. And we're seeing that. I mean, look at all the people who were at the insurrection who have lost their jobs. Look at people generally who have said certain things. So the internet will continue to be that place where that matters. And we're seeing companies, like Google, for example, I just read, where, people, their top AI ethicists, Black women, fired, and that has actually had some reputational risk. And you're seeing employees actually unionize against what they consider to be some of these concerns. I look at these platform companies as now in their teenage stages. Now, for anybody who's ever had a teenager, I have 2 kids. One is in college now, and he was a teenager. The other's a preteen, and I'm not sure if she's going to make it based on the fact that I'm older. The key thing is when they get to that stage beyond that infancy where they're starting to feel themselves, that they begin to act a little differently. And unfortunately, the regulatory systems that we have are not designed to actually put in full-fledged consumer protection. We're talking about the Federal Trade Commission that looks at these companies from an antitrust, anti-competitive point of view that is primary law enforcement. And we're talking about a Federal Communications Commission, which was enacted post the telegraph, that doesn't even touch these platforms. So we don't have at this point the right mechanism to even make sense of a rules of the road or the appropriate conduct to ensure that these folks are doing the right thing. That's the first thing. It's not to say that they're not going to try. I mean, what we saw with Twitter in the former president's tweets was an act of valor because, no one else had done it. And at the end of the day, it also cost shareholder value. So we're at this stage again where we have to consider the role that technology plays in our everyday life. And I think that's where you're seeing companies be very particular about what they put out, how they design these models. A lot of them find me on LinkedIn and they ask me for, some advice. If they're listening, I can't help everybody. I just can't. Right? I mean, I'm trying, but I can't. The key thing is it keeps people like us at Brookings in business because we're constantly thinking about ways to create these interdisciplinary conversations. Brookings just made first an AI policy in the National Think Tank Journal, just basically because we've been able to be a convener. But with that being the case, we don't know how this is all going to end up. You've got a majority House that is Democratic, Congress, how that looks in terms of how we move forward with the type of proposals that have been out there floating around prior to the election. We still have time to see, but there will be something. I always tell people there will be something. And for those who are listening, we actually have at CTI a podcast. It's called Tech Tank Podcast. We actually talk about these issues as well. So we'd love to continue the dialogue and partnership with you all, because somebody has to talk about these things. Because if we don't, they become something that plays out on the public media without people having a clear understanding of how that actually plays into their everyday lives.
Nicol, it's been such a pleasure talking to you, and I think you just mentioned Tech Tank. Before we close, I know we have kept you longer than what we had bargained for here today, so I appreciate your time. But tell us a little bit about the Tech Tank, and tell us a little bit more about where we can follow your new posts on Tech Tank before we close.
Yeah, I would urge everybody. I know I said a lot. I'm like the Oprah of technology. You give me a platform, and I'm just going to keep on talking, right? But the importance of it is, it's really important what you all are doing to continue to have people like myself who are not engineers, who are not business students, but are sociologists addressing your groups. Because I think that's the pathway forward, the more that we can actually have this cross-pollination of disciplines. With that being said, a lot of these issues we talk about at Brookings, all you have to do is go to the Brookings webpage. You'll find 2 streams of interest. And in fact, Aylin is actually on one of them, or will soon be on one of them, which is our AI bias work stream, which is related to any type of research in the bias space, as well as the governance and national security space. You'll see a range of research from authors across the world. We also have Tech Tank, which is our weekly newsletter, our daily newsletter. Well, there's any type of content coming from myself, former FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler, former Obama appointee Cam Carey, but anybody who works within our department who's working on these issues publishes regularly. And then we have Tech Tank Podcast, which is where we actually break down these conversations via podcast with legislators or everyday academics who are trying to make sense of these issues. So I would suggest you all follow that. And then in my spare time, I just like to put it out there because I think it's also an important resource for people trying to get up to speed with these issues. I'm also the board chair of TPRC, which is an annual convening. It happens next week, and it also happens in September this year, which brings together people to talk about these issues. And it also shares peer-reviewed papers. You want to follow me? I'm on Twitter at Dr. Turner Lee, and you can also follow me on the Brookings website. I cannot thank you both enough for having me. I hope the conversation was robust and rich, and that people will get something out of it.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nicol. And I'm a fan, so I'm certainly going to start following you. It really has been a very insightful and robust conversation. And thank you, John, for serving as a wonderful co-host. I hope, Nicol, we hope to get you back at some point again on the show, or otherwise it will be great to continue our conversation. So we are continuing our series on artificial intelligence next week, when I will be joined by my colleague, Dean Dana Matthew, Dean of the Law School of GW. We will be interviewing Erin Egan, Chief Privacy Officer of Policy at Facebook and a GW alumna. And I hope you can all join us then. Thank you again for joining today.